Well, my guest today is Virginia Aksan, who has written The Ottomans 1700 to 1923, An Empire Besieged. And I also asked my guest and open up with how did you get into the Ottoman Empire?
It began when I was 15, actually. I was in Turkey for a year, and at that age, it was 1961, 61, 62, and I attended the American Academy for Girls, also known as the Üsküdar Kız Lisesi. I was there because my father was teaching English, and this is when the new Turkish state was trying to inculcate English as the language of a second language they were learning. He was teaching at Marif Koleji in Moda in Istanbul. And so I saw a city that was then under 2 million people. Excuse me. And it was quite the most extraordinary adventure I'd ever had. So
I can imagine.
To that point, you know, I was raised on Long Island in New York City. So it was an American Broad kind of adventure. So then I had the opportunity in various stages to learn some Turkish, pick up some Arabic, and went back to do a PhD at the University of Toronto. There's some other little journeys in there I don't need to talk about, but did a PhD at the University of Toronto, which I finished in 1991. So that's how I got started.
It actually just occurred to me today that next year it will be 100 years anniversary since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think what's happening right now is we're witnessing a total revival of the way we think about this empire because of the centennial of World War I.
I actually came across the Ottomans for the first time by the Netflix series about the besiege of Constantinople, which I really found fascinating, and I just was fascinated by them, and this is something I have to learn more about in my case. So I really just kind of started reading more and more about it, and the more I read about it, it's more fascinating it gets.
Was that the BBC?
Netflix production. Oh,
it's Netflix. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, we are going to talk about Mahmud II today, and what is it about this sultan that makes him? He's kind of an important sultan, wouldn't you say, in the Ottoman Empire?
Right. Yes, he is the sultan on the throne at the time of the declaration of the Tanzimat, that is the new order, in which they pledged to reform the empire. And develop equality of citizenship, and all kinds of promises were made in there, including conscription, that is creating an army of conscripts. And it followed on the destruction of the Janissary, the old army of the Sultan, in 1826. So that's the most important thing. But, you know, it's a very, very tumultuous time in the Middle East. If you think about what's going on around in the world, the Ottomans will have 2 wars with Russia in that period. They've just come out of 3 or 4 more in the 18th century, and Napoleon has arrived in Egypt with Mahmud II's predecessor, Selim III. So, from my point of view, I find it important as opening the revolutionary era of the Ottomans and leading to the end and fall of the empire altogether.
So let's talk about the state of Selim III a little bit before we get into Mahmud. So what was the state of the Ottoman Empire? We talked before the recording, and you said that this was kind of the golden era of the Ottomans. So let's talk about the empire, the borders it had, and how widespread the empire was at this point.
Right. You've interviewed and talked to Alan Mikhail, whose book on the Selim III talks about how, but after Selim III,
Selim the First, I believe, not the third.
Sorry, Selim the First and Suleiman, Suleiman the Magnificent, as he's known, considered the widest advance, bordered. You're talking about territory bordered by the Danube, by the Caucasus and Iran on the east by the Red Sea and the Gulf, and on the west, you're talking about, of course, the Bosphorus, which is always used, but into Rumelia. So as far as Belgrade and just before 1700, they were as close as they could get to Vienna. So, and then the parts we often don't think about is Yemen, Arabia, and even into coasts of East Africa. So this is a widespread empire. And we still have trouble with what we want to call that territory. Is it the Middle East? Is it the Near East? Is it Eurasia, which is a term I like to use, and Europeans have a little trouble with, I think, because it bridges Asia and Europe. Is it Southeast Asia? Is it Southwest Asia? Southwest Asia was the term the Brits used for a long time. So it's a huge territory and immensely diverse, ecologically diverse, and also in terms of people, immensely diverse. So by the time of Selim III, they have repeatedly lost major battles, mostly on the Danube with the Russians. The army is in total disarray. The Janissaries have more or less disappeared, and they're relying entirely on local coalitions of what we call ayans. You might call them strongman, local pashas who gathered regional armies. And this is the status of the empire as Selim III takes the throne. Excuse me.
Did they have any economy to modernize the army? Did they have, was there thought about modernizing the army into the 18th century state?
Right. So if you look at what's happening in Europe in the 18th century, there is a consolidation of armies around kingdoms and kings, right? And so the enemies of the Ottomans are the Austrians and the Russians, right? And those three land empires do have some trouble with economy and organizing the army. But Europe proper, as represented by France and England, will soon become the global empires, are developing different ways of organizing their military forces. The Ottomans have trouble with securing taxes always. And by the end of the 18th century, they've created tax farms, much like the French do. And those tax farms are then put into the hands either of officials in Istanbul or of local officials, both of whom tend to be rapacious in the collection of the taxes that have to go to the center. So the economy is a bit bust. Now you need to talk to Şevket Pamuk, who is the expert on the Ottoman economy, and we're gradually learning a lot about the way money circulated at the end of the.
Did they still do the Christian taxation that if you were a Muslim, you had to pay extra tax at this point?
If you're a peasant, you're paying tax regardless.
It didn't matter if you were Muslim or Christian, like in the old days.
Right, you were paying taxes. The Christians are paying what's called the jizya, which is a head tax, which was supposedly in compensation for not having to fight in the army. So the Janissaries were the army. They were presumed to be Muslim, although in fact the Janissaries were always packed with from nationalities from all over the world, basically. But they were presumed to be Muslim, and it's a Muslim army. It's a Muslim palace. It's a Muslim empire, and the Christians are tolerated. They pay that extra tax. That will continue to be one of the major problems to the 19th century. What do you do about that? How do you draw the Christians into the new army?
Because as we know, a lot of people actually converted not to have to pay the tax. The jizya, that's, I believe you said, I'm sorry if I say that wrong, but so that would decrease the taxation as people, converted to being
Well,
Muslims.
that's part of it. That is part of it. So then one of the big discussions underway is now around confessionalism, that is, who is Christian, who is Muslim. I think you would find that the argument falls, well, the sultans really didn't try to convert people because they lost money, right?
Mm.
And in the 19th century, they pledged to make the Christians equal citizens. That means putting them into the conscription system, but nobody wants to do that. That becomes a true problem. Partly, it's argued that the Muslim soldiers don't want to fight side by side. They don't want Christian officers. But the other part of it is the money that the Christians are contributing to the tax base.
So didn't they have after a while as well involve Muslim children to the Janissary corps as well, because the lack of Christian tributes?
The Janissary tributaries, it was called the Devshirme, and it was a surgun. It means a gathering.
Mm.
So every 4 or 5 years, they would send Ottoman officials out into the provinces, largely the Balkans, to collect children between the ages of 13 and 18. And that was also considered a tribute. And they took them from the families. But that's finished. That is finished by 1700. That practice is finished. Other ways of coming in, replaced it in a lot of ways, is what is known as a Ghulam system. So Circassians of Caucasus area are brought into the court and join a particular pasha's household. Again, it is a kind of enslavement, but when you became a janissary, you were essentially liberated. So the whole way in which the army was gathered and organized and paid is undergoing systemic renewal throughout the 19th century.
Was the 1800s the time when the Ottomans were at the maximum height and they could not expand any further at this point?
Yeah, I think the border with Europe is pretty much fixed after 1715. There's a couple of major battles, major wars and fights in there, not just Vienna, but thereafter they go to war again. It involves Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And by 1750, the European border is pretty much set, and they can't go any further. It's worth knowing that Vienna is far more distant from Constantinople than Baghdad is.
So,
sorry,
yeah, no, that's fine.
The other way around. Vienna's like 500 miles and Baghdad's 1,300 miles, something like that. So it's, their concentration in Europe is for a reason. And the other thing that we have to think about is Wallachia, Moldavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, all of them are supplying the city, which is huge, of Istanbul with supplies. That means sheep, that means grain, the food that you need to feed the army.
And as we know, that's mostly came from Egypt, right? That's where the grain supply would derive from.
Sorry, say that.
That Egypt was the main delivery of grain supply, like in the Roman times.
Right. To get something like honey, you need sugar, you need flavoring. Honey comes out of the Balkans largely. So it's the supply issue has become a true problem by 1800 when the territories keep carving themselves off from the empire.
So, okay, let's start with Mahmud II now. And how does it gain the throne? Is it by the classic Ottoman way, by killing his brothers and gaining the throne in the classical sense, fit it that way, or is it only child like Solomon was, or how does it gain the throne?
Mahmud II is the last of the Ottomans, basically. He's brought down off the roof. That's why I call it the revolutionary age. Selim III, there's a huge city rebellion against Selim III. Selim III is the one who begins the revolution, the new order. And he is trying to create a new bunch of troops, regiments of new troops in Napoleonic style, side by side with the Janissaries, and that doesn't go. That won't go over. It's just not possible.
The Janissaries are way too corrupt at this point to allow that to happen, right?
Yeah. The Janissaries have become Well, I often refer to them as the voice of the people. That is to say, they're the only ones who can stand up to the Sultan and say, it's not going to work. And they always have to be consulted when the new Sultan is enthroned. He gives them what's called the Julus Basi. She gives them a big bonus when a new Sultan is enthroned. So Selim III comes to power in the middle of a crisis, and he does two things. He says, I've got to go to Europe to get information. And he starts sending diplomats out to report back on what's actually going on in Europe. Mm. Before that, all of the diplomatic community, the European communities in Istanbul, were talking to one another and conveying information to the Sultan. So the Sultan, Selim, decides, I got to get more information here. The other thing he does is understand from all of his advisors that the army is completely defunct, that it has to move to new kinds of technologies, it has to move to new kinds of organization, to discipline, etc. And so he begins the Nizam-i Jadid, as it's called, New Order. Eventually, quite apart from Napoleon's arrival in Egypt in 1798, the streets of Istanbul are very discontent with Selim III, and they rise up against him. And in the course of that, Mahmud II is hidden away, and he is the last Ottoman to come out of hiding and be enthroned. He was what, age 19, 18, 19.
Wasn't there talk about one point that Napoleon was supposed to come to Istanbul and train the army and help reform the army himself?
It was?
That Napoleon, I read somewhere that he was supposed to go there. Just imagine a different history might have been if he actually went through with it.
Well, I mean, he touches down in Egypt very briefly and then runs back to take on the war with Europe again. But Napoleon in Egypt does inaugurate a new era there, and you have Mehmet Ali, who immediately adopts the Muhammad Ali, as he's more commonly known, Mehmet Ali in Turkish, becomes the ruler of Egypt for the Ottomans, for the Ottoman Sultan, and challenges Mahmud II. One of the other possible ends of the empire in a great civil war that is finished finally in it ends 1839. Mahmud II dies, and then order is restored. But there's this chaos that's driven by not just the arrival of the global powers, the British and the French, in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in the attempt to revive the army. The empire itself has to go through this convulsive shift to new technologies, new ways of thinking, new ways of ordering, new ways of arranging your military in regimental fashion, in Napoleonic fashion. They adopt that pretty wholesale.
So yeah, back to Mahmud II, and you said that it was a revolution. Sorry for getting sidetracked there for a little bit, but you said there was almost a revolution going on here.
Well, I picked that word. Yes, I picked that word because we don't often say that a revolution can be driven by the head of state. But Mahmud II understood that he was taking the international stage, that he had to address the European powers in order to preserve the empire after he has taken care of the revolutions, the actually resistance from this now antiquated army, the Janissaries.
Is he the only brother he has to worry about, or does he have rivals that he have to take care of?
No, there's no rivalry. What he will have, Abdul Majid, there's a whole bunch of children that are from various of the predecessors, from Mustafa III, not Mustafa III, it's even Abdul Hamid.
Mustafa III was the Mad Sultan, right? He was one of the Mad Sultans.
No.
And there's I remember reading somewhere that there was some period of Mad Sultan. There was a Mustafa that was a sort of man crowned to that
There
man
is an
center.
argument for Ahmed III, who is the so-called tulip age at the turn of the 1700s, who stabilizes Istanbul by having 16 children who actually survive. And they marry into these pasha households. You get the creation of administration is very much different from let's kill off one another. But they're still operating on the patrimony of the sultanic purse. And that carries way over into Mahmud II. When one of the things you have to think about in Europe is at what point the military develops independence from the patrons of the kingdoms, right? Of the emperors and kings. And this thing takes a lot longer in the Ottoman Empire for there to be civil service developed, so independent military academy, shall we call it, general staff, the kinds of things that run contemporary armies just take well into the 19th century.
So what Mahmud II gains the throne, and what is the first thing that he do when he gains the throne? What does he choose to do?
He is enthroned by a coalition of these provincial lords who come to Istanbul with their armies to rescue him. And that is how he is put on the throne. And what he signs in the course of that is something called the Senedi Ittifaq. It's an agreement with those provincial landlords that they can more or less, they will support him if he leaves them alone. So that's why many look at this as a new era, that there's an agreement between king and the rule, between the rulers and the ruled.
Are they trying to get more a constitutional monarchy like Europe is starting to get at this point, or
he aims at a constitutional monarchy? But the first thing after that he does, when he is able to consolidate power, and that has to do with bringing in all his religious officials and saying, we're going to deal with you this way, confiscating a lot of their, what we would call alienated finances, the Vakfiyah, the Waqf, are property set aside for the purposes of religion as we have today. And so he confiscates, he's a good confiscator. He takes in a lot of money from officials. There's even a shocking moment when he executes a couple of his Jewish bankers, and bankers particularly of the Janissaries, and confiscates their estates. So he consolidates funds, and then he goes to the countryside and systematically takes down many of the challenging provincial lords we've talked about. So I refer to the latter period of Mahmud II as the reign of terror, because he had henchmen that would go out and try to replace the existing ones with more compliant lords, right?
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing in the 30 Years' War. It was going on in Europe in an earlier century.
So just basically take from Europe and choose. Does it know that this happened in Europe? I want to try the same in my empire.
Well, the whole question of translation or emulation of Europe is undergoing considerable renewal right now in the thinking of historians. Emulation, yes, but how does it pertain to your local system? And if you, for example, take the question of tax farming, that is allowing individuals to suddenly own property and pay their own taxes and serve in the army, which is part of citizenship. If you look at that contest goes on for 100 years in the Ottoman Empire because of the strength of these local systems and the tax farms that people long distance are controlling the way in which money moves from the ground into Istanbul. So that would be a local problem. That would be an Ottoman problem, not necessarily a European problem. But the idea of constitutionalism, the fascinating thing is there are 100 different constitutional ideas afloat in the Ottoman Empire. It comes out of the Armenians, the Greeks, the Ottoman army itself out of Mahmud II as he understood his constitutional monarchy. So the ideas are very much there. And, you know, there's so much going on at the same time. This effort to pacify the countryside, the effort to introduce new ways of organizing fighting manpower in conscription, the effort to earn money for the running of the empire. All those things are suddenly afloat, up for grabs, and under discussion at multiple levels. And then what happens is when the Christians in the empire start to get support from overseas in serious ways, and the British and the French involve themselves in the territories.
And we know how well it goes when the British involve themselves.
Yeah, well, in Egypt to start with, of course.
So how much power does he have? Does he have when you talked about constitutional power, monarchy, does he have absolute power still, or is it limiting his powers at this point, or is it not constitutional as we know it today?
Excellent question. 1839 is known as the Gülhane Edict, in which he declares equality of citizenship before European representatives. And the first time this is done, quality of citizenship, some effort about conscription, how everybody must serve in the army, and the whole, there are vague references to what should be done about the provinces and how they should be organized, etc. This document is still being discussed as what actually it said. Right now, people are writing about it and saying, what did he actually try to say? But this was his notion of constitutionalism. Whether or not the Muslims standing around him and the ilmiye, the religious class standing around him, understood that meant that every Christian was going to be like every Muslim in the empire, is still being debated. And so it's repeated again in 1856. This is after 1856. There's another Hati Humayun, as it's known. This is, again, declaration of how we're going to move forward with constitutionalism, what change looks like, what promises are made. And at that point, it looks like Europe is kind of strong-arming the Ottomans to do this. So, you know, Mahmud II, who is initiating it, then it's strengthened again in 86 under Abdul-Majid, and then you have the Crimean War, which brings Britain and France right into the middle of Ottoman territories. And from there on in, they are mixing everywhere. France and Britain particularly, but Italy's involved, of course, Germany's involved by the end of the century, all in trying to see that the Ottomans stick to what they promised to do in terms of Reformation.
As we know, in Europe, especially some in Scandinavia, where when we started getting constitutional monarchy, that the king had still power. So it wasn't constitutional, like it was just a symbolic sense. He still had power. Was this the case as well, that he still had power?
That's what you asked me. And all the way to 1876, when the first constitution of the Ottoman Empire is declared by Abdul Hamid, he still has power. The first thing he does once he's put on the throne is to close down the parliament. So that question is still up for grabs by the end of the empire.
But something that we talked about is Egypt, and it's kind of a red line across this episode, I guess. So what does it mean because as we talked about, that's where a lot of the grain supply comes, right? That's where a lot of the materials that the Ottomans need to feed the population, etc., comes from. So when Napoleon comes and he invades Egypt, what does it mean losing this province for the Ottomans?
Right. I have to think about that. What they're losing primarily.
Because Egypt is kind of a massive and important
I'm trying to think
Uh,
about what to
mm.
emphasize, because there are lots of things that are going on there. Egypt, of
Is
course.
it still relevant though? Is it still relevant kind of as a
Yeah,
province?
yes, it's still the gateway to Mecca and Medina.
Mm.
And that's the way a lot of the pilgrimage would come through that way. Abdul Hamid is building a railway to the Hijaz. I mean, these are important questions that I think we've ignored a bit, and seeing how the Ottomans desperately try to get into the international community, legal community at the end of the 19th century. But early on, that's 100 years before, what Egypt had become was a Mamluk territory. And this makes me want to bring up something I think is worth saying about, in continuation of the conversation you had with Alan Mikhail, about this business of having always to deal with these highly autonomous, highly mobile military formations like the Mamluks in Egypt. And the Napoleon is having to deal with men on horseback with his highly organized regiments. It's one of those moments military historians like, for the way in which the superior technology mows down the ignorant or tribalism, or the barbaric tribalism. I think that's a repeated notion about how the whole Middle Eastern history unfolds. And when Alan's
because as we know, in the Middle East was kind of the West, to put it that way,
yes,
to simplify it, in the Middle Ages, it was the place to be, I would say, in
the Wild West.
yeah, no, not the West, but like the West. That's what Europe would become in the Middle Ages. That this was that it was kind of this. I don't have the word for it right now, but trying to think of it was kind of the Middle Ages in the Middle East had this sort of golden age, to put it that way. They were they had all this.
Oh, right, Baghdad under the Abbasids. Yeah. Yes, and the Ottoman, the original Ottomans emerged out of the Seljuks, who come out of Asia, out of Central Asia, and they're descendants of the Tatars and the Moguls, right? So my point really is that the territories of the Ottomans are sitting not just on borders, as we talked about with Eurasia or Middle East,
but not just that, it's just also as well culturally and scientifically, astronomy. That's the Middle East was a place to be in the Middle Ages.
I gotcha. Right. The interesting thing about that is that the Turks don't get that respect, because the end of the Abbasids is brought about by the Mongols, right? And the successors to that, the Ayyubids and the Seljuks and so forth, use the Turks largely as their military man, Turkish warriors, but they're not given quite the credit that the Abbasids are for the astronomy and languages and preservation of Greek culture and all of those things that accompany the Arab dynasties. It's sort of the way the histories are written in Europe about that. But anyway, so
just an example that with them as a technology advice, that would be that the technology would be the fall of the Middle East. The European technology caused the fall because they didn't manage to modernize as quickly as Europe did.
Right. So military historians talk about the military revolution, how Europe figures out how to make fortresses, how to build the cannons, how to talk about the arc of bullets, how to create rifling, how to, all of those things that make for the modern army, and how slow the Middle East is to adopt it. That's wrong. There are other things that occur to make it slow down, but the Ottomans are very, very astute about emulating Europe, and there are foreigners and foreign technicians and scientists, etc., all over the empire. The doctors of the Sultan are Jewish. I mean, there's just there are ways in which the palace itself keeps up, but the society at large does not. So I mean, by the end of the 19th century, you have an arms race going on. The main reason Bismarck is interested in being involved in the Ottoman Empire is just because they can sell them arms.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Well, how the Bismarck-Anglo-Ottoman alliance, how does that happen? How does it, the Ottomans choose Germany?
Right, we go right back to Mahmud II. And Mahmud II, Helmut von Moltke, the elder, is part of a group that is brought in by Mahmud II to help them organize and reform the artillery corps. And that's the earliest of the Prussian connection, but it continues through the 19th century. So by the 1880s, you have Abdul Hamid himself, the most paranoid of all of the sultans, requesting a German commission and German teachers and trainers and arms technicians, artillery technicians, engineers. So there is von der Goltz, as he's known, who comes into the Ottoman context, reforms the military academies, the curriculum of the military academies, reforms, creates a general staff. And it's in this context that Enver, the Committee of Union Progress, the Turks that take the Ottomans through World War I, emerge in the military. So the German connection is more about sales, emulation of the Turks, of the prowess of the Germans when it comes to manufacturing by the end of the 19th century.
Is the only reason that Germany does do this alliance is because they get money out of selling weapons? Is that the only reason, or is it more to gain from this alliance?
Right. I think that remember, Germany is a new player on the international global colonial power scene, and so they're having to finance the acquisition of all the territories in Africa they get, and part of that is pushing the industrialization that's going on in the 19th. This is Bismarck. Bismarck is not necessarily interested in territory and Turkish or Ottoman territories, but he does want the connection. But it's does
he want German influence in the Ottoman Empire as well, or is it?
Yeah. So there's a very interesting character by the name of Mahmoud Shevket, who spends 10 years as a protege of Goltz in Germany. He translates many of the German manuals into Turkish. There's a whole connection here going on. The idea that the Ottomans might go with Britain into World War I is, I don't think, very credible by the end.
How does Britain feel? Did they care at all about the Ottoman Empire at this point, that they sided with Germany as an alliance and not Britain? Are they trying to intervene in the alliance like they usually do in the British sense, that they try to intervene in everything?
Well, if we jump back to Selim III, you don't mind my leaping all over the periods here. Selim III is he's a Francophile. He's corresponding with various people in France about the need for change in the Ottoman Empire, and the European historians have often wondered why he stuck to Napoleon even after Napoleon had come and attacked and the Ottomans, and they had to organize a whole campaign against him to march down and kick him out of Egypt ultimately in 1801. Not him, but the French who were left there. And the shift to Germany occurs, I think, under Mahmud II, but the Francophile connection continues too. The British, in spite of this notion about—
Are they worried at all?
No. In the 18th century, the people have looked at the correspondence with the ambassadors in Istanbul, say the French had consuls all over the Balkans. You know, they had representatives in all kinds of places. They were reporting to the Ottomans as well as back to France, right? They were keeping the Sultan informed. The Brits, for every single envoy or correspondence that came to a particular consul, for Britain, there might be 20 from France. I mean, you know, it was just the French had been there longer. They were very interested in the economy of the Eastern Mediterranean and had more connections with the Greeks. There were, you know, they just were more embedded in the British. It is the end of empire when they take Egypt that the British become more important to the whole scene. But they
don't really care about that Germany sided with the Ottomans. That's none of their business, to put it this way.
Well, they're certainly involved in rebuilding the Navy. I mean, one of the contexts for the declaration of war is that the British, who have undertaken to build a couple of dreadnoughts for the Ottomans, refuse to release them, confiscate them. And Germany jumps in.
I'm talking about when at the start of the alliance or at the height.
Oh, right. Well, you know, the interesting part of where the British get involved is over the Horn of Africa, right? Ethiopia on down. And that has to do with Yemen. Once the British are in Yemen, which is what, 1830s, 40s, 60s, somewhere in there, I can't remember the date. You know, that their interest in the Indian Ocean and the connection with Iran to prevent Russia, the whole latter context of the Ottoman struggle is between, in the great power mind, is between Britain and Russia, right? And so that's how they get involved.
And we will talk, of course, about the Russo-Turkish War in a second. But yeah, so I want to talk.
Their engagement comes at a later moment, and they fight with the Ottomans. Remember, 1801, that Imperial campaign, and its British soldiers are fighting against Napoleon, right?
Yeah.
And then they have another opportunity in the Crimean War, sitting side by side, Sevastopol. So I call it the Imperial mindsets. They're very different ways of dealing with your army, the way you organize and strategy and all that. And the British commanders, certainly in Crimea, the head guys were very contemptuous of the Ottoman command. They're just, you know, there wasn't any love lost, I don't think. The French, the Polish, the Hungarians, all of those who spill over into the empire after 1848 have a different relationship with the Ottomans. They serve them well, they become Muslims, they be part of their renovation. There are 50 to 100 commanders who are converts at any one time in the modernized army.
Now, before we go to the Russo-Turkish War, I want to talk about the disbanding, which something that we talked about earlier as well, but a little more in depth, which is what perhaps Mahmud II might be most famous for, disbanding the Janissaries. So how does it do that? How does it, because the way, if I remember correctly, it is quite brutal the way he does it.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that the actual number of people mowed down in Constantinople or in Istanbul varies from 1,000 to 10,000. But I think you find the public finally turning against the Janissaries.
Does it realize this, that if you want the public support, that the Janissaries are way too corrupt, that this can't be doing this work anymore?
Yeah, right. There's a whole, I mean, there's conspiracies galore going on and various factions, etc. Mahmud slowly, I mean, after all, he's on the throne as of 1808, and it's not to 1826 that he feels he can actually move against the Janissaries on the streets, right?
Yeah.
And all that time, there are there are some notion of continuing these new model troops, and they are fighting on the streets with one another. The Janissaries, there's a lot of chaos in Istanbul in the period. And so Mahmud finally gets a hold of it. He has a person who's in charge of the Janissaries who's with him about getting rid of them at that point, helping to change the system. And he has Husrev Pasha, who is a veteran of Egypt, and he has been in charge of the renewal that has been going on for a long point. And after 26, they'll really move forward. So there again, the Janissaries, there's a context. The Janissaries decide in multiple cases they're going to revolt again, and it's at this point, Mahmud
Enough is enough.
Huh?
Enough is enough.
Enough is, the city says enough is enough. They all talk, they talk in the 18th century about the citizens. That is the people who have to supply the Janissaries with their boots and their swords and their outfits and their food and whatever it happens to be, have had enough. They've all had enough. And so clearly what Mahmud II does is prepare his artillery. The thing that he spends all his time reforming is the cannoneers, and they're the ones who take down the Janissaries in the end.
So what does this have to say for the Ottoman army? I'm trying to been thinking about this actually for a while. And would you say that this kind of the disbandment of the Janissaries would made the Ottoman army irrelevant in a sort of way? That this is the kind of the fall of the Great Ottoman army? Yeah. I mean, you understand why he does this, as we just talked about.
Excellent question. Another excellent question. There are many who say 1826 is the end of empire, or 1839. The move to constitutionalism, that's the end of empire. I think there is a considerable willingness to constitute it as a constitutional monarchy, but then they have to confront the power of the Sultan. And it's really not until the turn of the century, 1909, that they see it as eliminating the Sultan altogether. So it's a very good question. When does the empire end?
And I mean, not that the army itself, that the army is kind of irrelevant after the fall of the Jannah.
Becomes huge because they're organizing along the Prussian model. They have a whole Redief system, as it is called, a reserve system. By the time you get to Abdulhamid, there are seven separate regional armies with headquarters, with high schools, and they are training military officers of all sorts, apart from the Christians. We can come back to that in a minute. So you have Arabs who are part of this late Ottoman Empire. It develops its own sort of rationale, its own way of working. And I call it, and you will read when you read Erickson's, if you get around to the book, counterinsurgency, he calls it. They create all of these small armies that are used for pacification, that are used for imposing new rules, that are using the moment to bring peoples who haven't been in the empire at all, such as the Kurds. The 1840s. This, they are desperate to bring the Kurds to become regular citizens of the empire. They've had such autonomy to that point. The resistance is enormous. So they're facing that in all the territories, the remaining territories of the Ottomans. So yeah, the new army has a new function. It's not the sons of the Sultan, as the Janissaries were conceived. He was their great father. It's based on conscripts, and that requires censuses. So for the first time, the Ottomans have an idea how big their population is, how many there are, how many they can take from it, etc.
And I find it necessary to do a consensus before this point.
Yeah, the earliest census is from Istanbul in the 1830s. So they got the census. It takes time for these things to get imposed, but you have a series of rather brilliant administrators across from 40s to 70s who are conceiving of provincial reorganization, for example. 1867, there's a new province law. The whole idea is to try to grasp territory from the hands of these local regional lords in order to distribute to the new citizenry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those processes are going on at the same time, all these rebellions. And so much of it is couched in terms of Christian-Muslim disputes. For example, in 1840, Beirut, there's various constituencies, militarized constituencies, that are fighting one another. But it is the Christian communities that bring in Britain and France to settle the dispute, right? So what constitutes an Ottoman citizen is also very much under debate this whole period. And where and how the Christians do or do not fit into it is still something that we're thinking about. The most recent work is looking at legality, the way the legal system is being rewritten to accommodate the new kinds of investment, the loans. You know, the Ottomans are basically bankrupt after Crimean War, so they're taking loans out. They have to take loans out even for Bismarck to sell guns to the Ottomans. He has to lend them money to do so.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
And that's true. You know, they are under public debt administration after the 1880s.
So that brings us to the Russo-Turkish War. How does that work without how well does the army function without the Janissaries? Where they done at this point, and how does the Russo-Turkish War play out?
Which one are we talking about?
1878, I think, or still in Mahmud's time. Then I don't have the time dates in my head right now.
The immediate war after the elimination of the Janissaries, 1828-29, when Russia and the Ottomans go to war in Wallachia, Moldavia, as they have for centuries, basically. But the 1877-78 war, Russo-Turkish War, as it's called, it's the war of the Ottoman atrocity, Bulgarian atrocities. It lasts a very short time, but it becomes a social media, an international scandal, because some of these uncontrollable troops who are officially Ottoman irregulars in the new army, like Pasha Bozuks, as they're called, they're locally organized. They might be Albanian, they might be some other group, they might just be a bunch of guys that comes together as part of the irregulars. They're functioning in some ways as local police forces. There's a clash between some Bulgarian villages and these troops over some simple. All it takes is one little spark to get it going. So the result is a serious what's the word we use for these? A serious clash results in a serious number of deaths. This is quickly reported. That war has been dubbed the Breakfast War because Londoners are reading about every phase of it in the newspapers, and then it becomes an international incident, and it brings the powers to bear on the Ottomans. And it's after that you see Britain and France and Germany and Russia, all of them keen on how they're going to deal with the Balkans in general. So that again immediately falls on the constitution declared the arrival of Sultan Mahumd II. He closes down the parliament as a result of this war. So the question you're asking is, how did they fare?
Not very well.
Not very well initially. They lost the media game. They lost the opinion, the international opinion game. But subsequently, there's a great standoff at Plevna, where the new reformed army does very well against being besieged by the Russians. So that too comes into play. They have made certain transitions, but European opinion is divided, mostly not divided, on what should happen to them, which is they should disappear from Europe at this point.
And on top of this, we do have the Great War of Independence as well. So how does that work out for the Ottomans?
Well, as you know, this is the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, as they call it, 1821. And there are all kinds of new books about this and lots of rethinking about what actually happened. Again, it was probably the first moment that the great powers arrived in, after Napoleon, of course, participated in the fight in the Morea, the Peloponnese of Greece, right? And you have all kinds of carpetbaggers, as someone has called them, in favor of the Greek, the Phihellens, those who are lovers of Greece of the classical age, who come to the rescue of Greece. But the fighting on the ground, it just looks like these.
Is it guerrilla warfare mostly at the time?
Yeah, right, guerrilla warfare. So in that case, the Ottomans do have the troops of Mehmed Ali, who's cooperating with Mahmud II, who sends troops to help, and those troops are well organized. And it's just the great powers, first of all, destroy the Ottoman Navy by blowing it up, and then step in. And then there's never a war declared. They just do it. Navarino in 1827, one of the significant moments when the great powers declare against the survival of the Ottoman Empire, it seems to me. Although the whole, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, doesn't the Greek independence movement as well have a lot of support in Europe, in several European countries?
Yeah, and it's a long time after. I mean, the original country of Greece had 1/3 the population of Greeks. The other 2/3 were all over the remaining Ottoman territories. They're deeply embedded, and the Armenians even more so. They're everywhere. Every city of the empire has Greek citizens. It has Armenian citizens, and the accommodations that are made over the century to allow freedom of expression, to what we would call freedom of expression, to allow the creation of new religious groups. There's a whole lot of sectarianism going on among the Christians because of the Ottoman declaration that they can now be citizens of the empire. But Christians in the Muslim army wait until after 1900.
It is. I was reading. This is a few years later, 50 years later, of course. But I was reading Jerry Mango's From Sultan to Ataturk a while ago, and it is fascinating to me how close in the 1920s the Greeks actually were to conquer Constantinople, and that without Ataturk, it might be Greece now and not Turkey.
Yeah, right. Well, yes, the Greek after the 1918 when the armistice, when the Ottomans surrender, there are a lot of Greek ships that arrive and unload around Istanbul, and this is where Izmir, Smyrna, is burned. And that's the final battle between the Greeks and Turks in that period. And do not pretend to be an expert on all this, but it is the fact that the Ottoman World War I army had not been disbanded at that point. And Ataturk does not just have the peasants, the Turkish view of this is that the Turkish peasants came to his rescue and they gathered together and they, defeated the Greeks. But there were still units of the Ottoman military all scattered in Anatolia. So, what do you call it? What do you call it? The Greeks call it the War of Reconciliation. No. I don't know. I won't misrepresent it.
You can Google it if you listen to the episode and find out.
Yes, because as I said, in much the same way that World War I is getting another look, so too, the Greek Revolution, subsequent events, right? During the Crimea, the Greeks were still very keen to take parts of the Turkey away from them, and the British found themselves having to defend the Ottoman Empire against the Greeks. And then, they're basically financed by the European powers until what, 1860s, 70s in there. So is it a revolution? That's why I'm being very fluid with the definition of revolution.
Yeah, another thing that's fascinating as well is how tensions between Turkey and Greece are still pretty tense to this day, that it's never really resolved or dissolved, I suppose. It's still pretty tense to this day.
Yeah, I think what our new work is showing is the legacy of this period, and then the Mandate period, and then the arrival, post World War II even, how we get a Middle East about which where the Palestine-Israel question seems to be the major issue, but there's a whole lot more of the legacy of that period. Humanitarianism and the colonial power and humanitarianism emerge together. They're sisters of one another. And this happens in the Crimean War, basically. And humanitarianism is with the Armenians after World War I. This kind of response is embedded in the United Nations in the way we think about handling these questions. So it's still with us.
And thank you. I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you so much for coming, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And before you go, do you have any social media, anything you want to promote, and links to which we need to put in the description?
No, you know what, COVID, it's a Routledge book, and Routledge is a mega producer of books these days.
Actually, I would ask, where can people buy your book, The Ottomans, 1700-1923, An Empire Besieged, if they are interested in reading your work? Yeah,
I think you can find it on Amazon, Amazon.com. You also can go directly to Routledge. Routledge, it's Taylor and Francis is the mega body that controls the publications. It's just a stunning amount of work coming out on the Ottomans right now. And what I would say was, just if you're astute enough, the COVID-19 has driven us all onto the web, and there are far more collaborations across the world, because it is an area that has given rise to a whole German world about the historiography, and a French world and an English world. And we have had the opportunity in the Balkans, particularly, who I think are themselves the younger scholars, going through this renovation about this whole period, and it's quite exciting.
What do you think has given the rise to the Ottomans recently? That has been a lack of, I wouldn't say the lack of, but I'm going to use the term anyway, lack of interest until the recent years that in the Ottoman Empire.
I think they continue. I think Afghanistan, for one reason, the end of that, which looked very much like the end of empires after the mandates. The fact that we're far enough away. Centennials always drive historians. So the World War I centennial did it. The whole concert of Europe, what that was, is undergoing, with the EU, is undergoing a reassessment. So time makes a difference. But it's also the case that for unknown reasons, it seems like several dozen young Ottoman scholars who have come out of the schools where my generation have been teaching, but also out of the areas, right? Out of the territories, the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. And they want to know about it. So
do you think that the sort of, because as after the fall of certain areas where the Ottomans once ruled, that the areas are kind of embarrassed about having been a part of that history. Do you think that's changing now? Do you think that is the case, that they're not as embarrassed as they used to be of being a part of the Ottoman Empire anymore?
Right. Well, just one thing that astonished me when I read about it was that the British sent 2.5 million colonial soldiers to the Middle East in World War I. And it's only recently, with the centennial, that they are getting the recognition for what they actually, the actual colonial troops. There's a book by Eugene Rogan on and the empire in World War I, which is a fine, very fine work. And I think he's the one that says it was a Tower of Babel on the fighting one another on the fields. You had African troops, you had all the colonial troops of both France, Britain, Italy, fighting one another in Syria and Iraq. And who knew? I mean, history gets blurred and clarified over time. And right now, I think we're filling the blanks.
You were talking about World War I a while ago, and as we know, it's not just Germany. It's not as simple to put it that way. It's not simple, but in World War II, it's obvious that the Nazis were the bad guys and the Allies were the heroes. But in World War I, it's so much more complicated. That Germany, there wasn't really kind of bad guy in that sense when we looked at World War II, but it's so much more complicated than that.
Right, and so there is a tendency to cast back from your present place when you're looking at history and be anachronistic about it. And
it's so much more complicated by the end of the Ottoman Empire as well, that they weren't just a sick man of Europe as we know them towards the fall.
Yeah, right. Well,
thank you so much for coming.
It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, and before you go, I want to say that we are available. If you want to take a look at this podcast, we are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. We are also on Instagram under Word.h12, as well as TikTok now, Word.h12 too. We are, please consider liking and subscribe, and then rate us on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. Please write a little review if you like. My name is Alan. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.